Think about the last time you laughed at something in a movie because it was so absurd, so obviously over the top, that the entire joke rested on the idea that it could never actually happen. Now picture watching that same movie 30 years later, and discovering the joke isn't funny anymore, not because it aged badly, because it's Tuesday. That's Demolition Man. In 1993, audiences sat in theaters and watched a film about a future where a machine on the wall finds you every time you swear, where physical contact between strangers is outlawed, and where there hasn't been a murder in over 20 years because one man decided safety mattered more than freedom, and everyone quietly went along with it. People laughed, and of course they laughed, because it was Sylvester Stallone in a unitard fighting Wesley Snipes in bleached dreadlocks, and the absurdity was clearly the point. Except here we are, not quite in 2032, but close enough that it stopped feeling comfortable. Demolition Man opened in October 1993, directed by Marco Brambilla in his feature debut, written in part by Daniel Waters, the same writer behind Heathers, and that connection matters more than it might seem, because Waters had a gift for hiding a real knife inside a comedy. The film puts Stallone in the role of John Spartan, a cop frozen in cryo prison in 1997, alongside his nemesis, the gleefully psychotic Simon Phoenix, played by a Wesley Snipes who appears to be having the single greatest time any actor has ever had on a film set. Spartan wakes up in 2032 in a city called San Angeles, and discovers that the world around him has become so aggressively safe that its police force has forgotten how to handle anything dangerous. That premise reads like a comedy setup, and it is one. But here's the thing: the film understood that most of its audience didn't catch the first time around. The joke was always a question wearing a costume. What are you willing to give up to feel safe? The answer the film arrives at is everything, lost gradually, without anyone quite noticing it go. Raymond Cocteau, the man running San Angeles, never seized power through force. There was no coup, no moment of declared tyranny, no tanks in the street. What there had been was an earthquake, then riots, then a man with a calm and reasonable voice who stepped forward and said he could fix things. And he did fix them. In the way that quiet authoritarians tend to, by stripping out everything that felt dangerous until compliance was all that remained, dressed up in the language of harmony. Nigel Hawthorne plays Cocteau, and his performance is extraordinary in a way that's genuinely easy to miss because the film never signals you to be afraid of him. He's soft-spoken and cultured and carries the patient, faintly disappointed tone of someone who simply knows better than everyone around him and has rearranged the world to reflect that certainty. None of the ranting energy of a standard movie villain, none of the theatrical menace, and that's exactly what makes him land. The film gives him room to be unsettling, in a quieter register than anything happening in the action sequences, and Hawthorne fills that room completely. What's worth noticing about Cocteau's method is that he never banned anything by calling it evil. Every prohibition came wrapped in reason. Cigarettes were a health risk, red meat was a health risk, physical contact was a disease vector, and profanity was hostile to civil discourse. Each individual decision sounds defensible in isolation, and that accumulation, that slow layering of reasonable-sounding restrictions, is what becomes the cage. By the time you'd noticed the bars, you'd already been inside long enough that the cage felt like the shape of the world. By 2032, murder is essentially non-existent. So is argument, dissent, spicy food, physical contact, and the freedom to decide for yourself what risks are yours to take. Spartan picks up 40 credits in fines for saying damn, and the little machine on the wall prints him a ticket, polite as anything. It's one of the film's biggest laughs on first watch. Somewhere around the third or fourth viewing though, or maybe just somewhere around the last few years, it starts reading less like a punchline and more like a dry run for something. The screenwriters were drawing on the specific anxieties of 1993. AIDS had permanently altered how people thought about physical contact. Los Angeles had burned through the riots of 1992, and political correctness was a genuine and heated cultural flashpoint. The film took those anxieties and followed each one to its logical, absurd extreme, building a society so afraid of harm that it had outsourced all judgment to systems, to rules, to the man who happened to write the rules. What the film couldn't have fully anticipated was that we'd one day find ourselves having completely serious conversations about whether handshakes should be retired, or watching toilet paper vanish from supermarket shelves, or living in a world where an algorithm can flag your words before any human being has read them. Nobody designed any of that to happen. It just accumulated, the way things tend to. One detail that's easy to sail past on a first watch is that Sandra Bullock's character carries the name Lenina Huxley, taken directly from Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, a novel about a future so thoroughly comfortable that it becomes a kind of suffocation. Bullock plays her as genuinely enthusiastic, warm, and completely unable to see that her utopia is a cage. She collects 20th century memorabilia, the way people collect artifacts from an era they've romanticized but never actually had to survive. Stallone's old case files, objects from a world she finds thrilling at a safe remove. There's something quietly devastating in that portrait. Lenina isn't a villain, and she's not complicit in any calculating sense. She simply grew up inside the system and absorbed it the way people absorb the world they're born into, because it was the only world she'd ever known. She reads police reports from the 1990s the way people read adventure novels, drawn to the intensity from a comfortable distance, wanting the feeling of it without the weight. The film is affectionate enough never to call that a flaw outright, while making absolutely clear that's precisely what it is. Hers is also the most recognizably human character in the film, which is worth noting, given that the film contains Wesley Snipes killing people with their own eyeballs. Stallone gets to play the man out of time, and he's genuinely funny at it in a way that suits him better than the straight action hero role would. Spartan isn't framed as someone with all the answers. He's a blunt instrument produced by a world that rewarded blunt instruments, and he's every bit as wrong for 2032 as wrong for him. That's an unusual move for a film of this type, where the genre convention dictates that you send in the old-school tough guy, he restores order, and the credits roll. Demolition Man keeps resisting that resolution. It keeps circling back to the same uncomfortable possibility. What if neither extreme is actually the answer? The Scraps, the underground community led by Denis Leary playing essentially a one-man libertarian manifesto, represent the other failure mode. Total freedom, no compromise, rat burgers in the sewer, and the firm conviction that this constitutes authenticity. Edgar Friendly is funny and magnetic, and also, on close inspection, a bit of a nightmare, a man whose entire philosophy collapses into nobody tells me what to do, right up until he starts telling everyone what to do. The film holds both of these up to the light without choosing between them. It lays out suffocating order on one side and romanticized chaos on the other, and the middle ground, the place where a workable life might actually be found, remains genuinely unresolved when the credits roll. Wesley Snipes deserves a moment of his own here. Simon Phoenix stands as one of the great film villains of the 90s, and he doesn't get nearly the credit he's owed. Snipes plays him as pure unbothered appetite, violent and gleeful, and completely untroubled by consequences, which makes him oddly compelling to watch in a way that a more conventionally menacing villain wouldn't be. Early in the film, Phoenix walks out of a parole hearing, and the 2032 police simply freeze. They've prepared for a world without violence, and now violence is standing in front of them grinning, and their training manual doesn't have a chapter for this. It's played for laughs, and it lands, but what Snipes is actually performing in that scene is a stress test. Phoenix is the thing that happens when a society optimizes so completely for peace that it loses the capacity to respond to anything outside that optimization. The bureaucracy seizes, the systems fail, and the only available solution is to go back and retrieve the person who was locked away for being too dangerous for the previous world, because the new world has nothing left in its toolkit. Whether that's a tragedy or just an irony, the film leaves entirely up to you. Then there are the three seashells, the film's most beloved running joke. What replaced toilet paper, and why does everyone in 2032 know exactly how to use them except John Spartan? The film never tells you. Stallone has never explained it publicly either. It sits there as a tiny perfect piece of world building, a joke about how completely a culture can shift across a few decades until the things that feel obvious to one generation are genuinely alien to the next. And that's actually what the whole film keeps doing underneath the action. It's not really making predictions. It's asking you to notice how quietly the present becomes unrecognizable. How Spartan went under in 1997 and woke up in a world that had moved on without him, reshaped not through any dramatic break but through gradual incremental adjustment, each new rule added in response to a reasonable concern, each freedom narrowed by a sensible margin. Until one day you're sitting in a restaurant that used to be a different restaurant that used to be a different restaurant, and all of them have become Taco Bell. In the UK version of the film, all of that becomes Pizza Hut, because the studio swapped the product placement for international markets. Which is, if anything, an even funnier joke than the one the American audience got. Here's what makes watching Demolition Man in 2026 a genuinely different experience from watching it in 1993. 6 years separate us from the date on the screen. The film didn't land every prediction. There's no cryo prison, Schwarzenegger made it to governor rather than president, and most restaurants have not yet consolidated into a single chain, though the trend lines are not entirely reassuring. But the emotional texture of the world the film imagined is closer than anyone who laughed at it in a theater in 1993 would have expected. The creeping sense that safety and control have quietly become the same argument. The genuine difficulty of drawing the line between caring about people and deciding on their behalf what they're permitted to experience. The film doesn't locate that line for you. It just shows what happens to a society when the people drawing it stop asking where it should go, and it manages to do that while Stallone punches someone through a wall and Snipes cackles in the background. That combination, a genuinely considered set of ideas living inside an utterly committed action film, is rarer than it sounds and harder to pull off than it looks. Critics in 1993 largely passed on it, calling it too loud and too silly, Not quite serious enough to qualify as proper science fiction, and not quite comfortable enough as a pure blockbuster. They weren't wrong about any of that. They just didn't have a framework for a film that was deliberately both things at once, and they marked it down for the confusion. 30 years on, that's precisely why it holds up. So watch it tonight, or rewatch it, or find someone who's never seen it, and put it on. Not for the predictions checklist, which is genuinely fun, but also the least interesting thing the film has to offer. Yes, Spartan climbs into a police car, and Huxley tells it to drive itself, and it does. Yes, they speak to voice assistants mounted on the wall. Virtual reality, biometric identification, no-contact social greetings, and a storyline about how a succession of epidemics led to the banning of physical contact entirely, all of it is there, and if you want to spend the runtime ticking items off against the present day, you'll run out of list before you hit the halfway point. The reason to watch is what sits underneath all of that. Somewhere between the explosions and the one-liners, and Snipes doing something genuinely unhinged with his eyes, Demolition Man keeps returning to a question that doesn't have a clean answer. What gets traded away when a society trades away discomfort? What disappears when every rough edge gets filed down? And is there a version of safety that doesn't, at some point along the way, become control? Those questions had no easy answers in 1993, and they're harder now, and the film earns the right to ask them by never pretending it knows the answer itself. It lights the fuse, steps back, and lets the two most opposed forces it can conjure try to work things out in the rubble. The question stays with you after the credits roll. It's been staying with people for 30 years, which is probably the clearest explanation for why we keep coming back to this film. Find it tonight, and if you already know the 3 seashells joke, ask yourself honestly whether the world it comes from still feels as ridiculous as it did the first time you heard it. Leave that answer in the comments. I'm genuinely curious.